Okay, guys, so I'm going to take you through an example comparison of two paragraphs um, responding to this paper 2 prompt about exploring the different ways that writers emphasize various kinds of hierarchical relationships in their works. Now, the abstract comparison at the center of this pair of paragraphs is this: the representation of protagonist subordination in the face of dominant social forces. So, protagonists being made to be subordinate, being forced into a position of inferiority in the face of some form of dominant social force that is emphasized in either one or a pair of the usually antagonistic characters in the text. So look at this first sentence. You just simply articulate an abstract link. An abstract link, a comparison, or a point of contrast. Usually it's easier to find a connection, and then the contrast comes from the way that the two writers present this particular abstract idea. But both writers present dramatic moments of protagonist subordination in the face of dominant social forces. So we've got that is the basis of the link between the two plays. Then the next sentence in this is a two-part sentence using the subordinate in conjunction structure, but it's focused on conventions. It's focused on how the writers achieve the idea outlined above using dramatic conventions. Now, I've deliberately written this to be a little bit expansive so I can show you how to revise it down, because one of the things that I'm seeing a lot in these comparative sentences is many of you are trying to fit too much in them. So I've shown you here in this example what I mean by this. Where Pinter emphasizes Stanley Weber's anxious paranoia at the prospect of the arrival of the embodiments of social orthodoxy, Goldberg and McCann, through stage directions and disjointed dialogue with Meg in Act 1, Williams emphasizes Blanche's vulnerability to the brutal animalistic materialism embodied by Stanley at the conclusion of Scene 3, not the Scene 3, the conclusion of Scene 3, through his use of character actions and setting. Now, the ideas that are being expressed there are the right kind of things to express, but there's just simply too many things going on, and there are simply too many abstract constructions or abstract nouns, and this is what often loses the focus. And this is not the place to be expansive with a wide range of these concepts. You want to keep this as minimal as possible. Here, we don't really need the embodiments of social orthodoxy. We just need Goldberg and McCann. Stanley Weber's anxious paranoia at the prospect of the arrival of Goldberg and McCann, and you could turn this into a noun phrase. At the prospective arrival of Goldberg and McCann through stage directions and disjointed dialogue. I think we can leave the specifics of where and when this happens for a topic sentence. Through stage directions and disjointed dialogues. We've got the who and the what and the why still in that element of this sentence. Where Pinter emphasizes Stanley Weber's anxious paranoia at the prospective arrival of Goldberg and McCann through stage directions and disjointed dialogue, Williams emphasizes Blanche's vulnerability to the brutal animalistic materialism embodied by Stanley. I think here we don't again need to say where this is all happening. Through his use of character actions and setting. Okay, so we've got there a nice clear comparison that's focused on how both writers achieve the abstract idea outlined above using dramatic conventions. So in that subordinate in conjunction structure, we save the second writer for the main clause here, because we are using the first clause of the sentence to pinpoint what's going on in this paragraph. Okay. So we're focusing here on Pinter. The first supporting detail is all of this, creating a dramatic reversal in the hierarchy of power during Act 1. Pinter presents Meg simply declaring to Stanley that she's expecting visitors. In response, he simply turns and expresses disbelief by asking what? Urgently moving towards Meg, his body language, previously complacent in the opening act, betrays his sense of paranoia and fear here, as he finds himself subordinate to a character he has previously dismissed and tormented. Now, one of the things I've been explaining to you a lot is the way that you can use this participial phrase here, creating a dramatic reversal in the hierarchy of power during Act 1. Pinter presents Meg, as a way of making your contextualization of evidence very active sounding. It forces you to write in the present tense. It's forcing you to explain what's going on in terms of action in the part of the play that you're about to deal with. And then we've simply got in this a quote that's embedded within that first sentence, that she's expecting visitors. The job of this next sentence is simply to add further embedded details. It's not explaining them or analysing them or probing them for connotations. And it's just describing what he's doing with the actions embedded into this. In response, he simply turns and expresses disbelief by asking what. Then we've got analytical comment here, urgently moving towards Meg, and we've got that same grammatical structure, a participial phrase moved here. His body language, previously complacent in the opening act, betrays his sense of paranoia and fear. So we've got some technical element of the stagecraft specified and named, body language in the stage directions you could add, and then the implied significance of this, his sense of paranoia and fear as he finds himself subordinate to a character who's previously dismissed and tormented. So remember, in those supporting details here, there's 5 tasks to contextualize, to embed, to name a technical feature and probe its significance, and if you can and find yourself to have time to do so, to come up with an additional point about the implied significance. Then the second supporting detail follows. It's signified by a transition or discourse marker furthermore, and then it has that same dynamic. He's described grinding a cigarette and pacing the room in the stage directions. So again, it's contextualized briefly and embedded in that one sentence. So those 2 jobs are being carried out by this first sentence here. Then it names a linguistic feature in the stage directions. Pinter's dynamic verbs, used with consistent restraint, portray Stanley's underlying fear and frantic anxiety, which is at odds with the seemingly simple but disjointed questions that he asks of Meg. So seeing his anxiety here at this reversal through what he does rather than what he says. But again, that final probing of the significance takes place in its own sentence. So it names something and then probes the significance of it in that final sentence. So actually, all 4 of those jobs are taking place in 2 sentences, contextualizing and embedding, naming and exploring the connotations in that one. Then we've got a third supporting detail. He opens by asking, when was this? But moves into a greater sense of claustrophobic paranoia as he realizes they will be arriving at the boarding house. This has a slightly different structure because the point that's being made here requires several different details to make sense. He questions repetitively if they're arriving here. They wanted to come here. So we've got here really 2 little details that require contextualization and embedding, because it's actually talking about the way his questions change over a sequence. So you can't make that point with one detail. But again, the exploration is the same. The gradual shift in his questioning, from broad ones regarding the event to more precisely focused examples fixated on their arrival at the boarding house, combined with his anxious movement to construct Stanley's sudden sense of inferiority and subordination to the social forces which these mysterious visitors represent. And so this is where it's really come back to that opening point very clearly and explicitly. Then, after that third supporting detail, we move on to a passage that I would say was most consistently missing from lots of the essay writing in paper 2 format that you all did last year. And this is why I gave you those thematic statements in class a few days ago to look at, because it's at this point where you have to think about, okay, well, what's the big abstract argument the writer is making at this point in the text? So here it's explaining Pinter's purpose, which connects this section of the text to one of those core thematic arguments. One of the key features of this is the use of tentative language, which is phrases like Pinter seems to be, Pinter may be suggesting, it could be argued that. And this is the point where we don't know exactly, English is not a concrete yes or no, black or white subject. and you're being asked to suggest what you think the writer's abstract point is that he's making or she's making. So here, Pinter seems to be suggesting that the power hierarchies which shape our interaction appear to be arbitrary, as the previously downtrodden Meg finds herself inducing this state of wild paranoia without even understanding this eventuality or how it occurred. Power hierarchy seems to be completely accidental here. She doesn't even aware that this is being carried out. And then finally, we have this sort of two-directional sentence, and I always call this the Janus-faced sentence, after the Roman god Janus, who has two heads and looks into the past and in the future. You have the subordinate in conjunction structure, where one part of it, the subordinate clause, looks back at the paragraph you've just written. So here, where Pinter makes use of understated stage directions and disjointed dialogue to create the sense of his protagonist's vulnerability to the power of orthodoxy, and then the main clause pokes us in the direction of the next paragraph. Williams makes extensive use of his set and stage directions to portray Blanche's lack of power in the face of the materialistic individualism embodied by Stanley Kowalski. And so that shifts us into this second paragraph. Now, the topic sentence in this second paragraph doesn't need to deal back with the other text. It can focus in more detail on the way that dramatic conventions are used to shape the meaning that's been set up in that last sentence of the previous paragraph. So its explicit focus is which theatrical conventions are used and how this relates to the question of power hierarchies and the abstract comparison that's being made about protagonist subordination. Williams uses both stage directions and set manipulation, those are the conventions, to emphasize the deep, compulsive connection between Stella and Stanley during their reunion at the end of scene 3, contrasting this with Blanche's isolation in the face of the triumph of the materialistic ideology signified by their union. Again, this is quite expansive and could easily be trimmed by taking the sort of where and the when out of this sentence, like this. During their reunion, contrasting this with Blanche's isolation in the face of their, you could just say, triumphal reunion. That would simplify things. Swaying across the porch in a state of drunken frenzy, Stanley's brutal animalistic barbarity is emphasized by Williams, who describes his voice bellowing like a baying hound. So again, that process of contextualizing, using a participial phrase, embedding the detail within that sentence is being carried out in a single sentence here, which you can do. If you're struggling with this, I would say fragment that down into separate sentences. Contextualize it. That would look like this. Swaying across the porch in a state of drunken frenzy, Stanley's brutal animalistic barbarity is emphasized Williams. Full stop. Emphasized by Williams. He describes his voice as bellowing like a baying hound. Or he goes on to describe his voice as bellowing like a baying hound. Often that attempt to do too many jobs at once is what creates a loss of grammatical and clarity in student writing. So again, once we've got that embedded detail, we move into this part. This simile in the stage directions establishes the way in which his domineering behavior in the scene appears to be both animalistic and compulsive, as if he is only partially in control of his actions, which seem subject to larger, more powerful forces. So again, it names a particular linguistic feature within those stage directions and then explores the implied significance of this in relation to the prompt and the question. It then moves on to a second supporting detail. This precedes his iconic shouting of her name with heaven-splitting violence, which again gives us the sense that he is acting in consort with forces beyond his own individual control. Now, this is doing all of those jobs, contextualizing, embedding, and exploring. It doesn't really name anything here because this is really a supplementary detail to the first one. It's really just building on that first point. So all of the steps are executed in a single sentence there in order to move quickly to a slightly more substantial difference in the third supporting detail. Responding to this wild animalistic calling, again using that same grammatical structure of the participial phrase, Williams has Stella slipping down the rickety stairs in her robe as they come together with low animal moans. So again, contextualization and embedding are taking place in one sentence. Here, the stage directions construct their reunion in both savage and fatalistic terms. So, again, naming a specific, in this case, dramatic convention rather than a linguistic feature, but either is okay. And then exploring the implied connotations, as if the couple is destined to be together and reunite as a pillar of strength, itself a sign of the triumph of the brutal barbarism of the value system that Stanley embodies. Then we move on to a fourth supporting detail here. Emerging fearfully on this scene, Blanche's isolation is emphasized as she slips fearfully down the stairs, again, contextualizing and embedding in the same way. Here, the movements of both characters are in direct counterpoint, so it names dramatic convention, the movements of characters. As Stanley commands this external space and Blanche tentatively treads in his wake, fearful and lonely as a result of his violent reprisal and reunion with Stella. So it names and then explores. And then it moves on to that writer's purpose. It seems here, again, tentative language, that Williams is emphasizing the way in which Blanche finds herself at odds with social forces that are destined to prevail in spite of their moral limitations and render her entire identity obsolete in the face of individualistic materialism. So we've got this connecting what's going on in this scene to one of those big abstract purposes that connects to the prompt, hierarchical relationships, and the way that both playwrights emphasize protagonist subordination in the face of social forces. It's really where you're answering the question. You've done all that analytical work and you're bringing what you've done back to that question and prompt focus. And then a comparative concluding sentence that sums up the similarities and differences using that subordinating conjunction structure. While Williams makes extensive use of poetic stage directions and set design to construct this sense of his protagonist subordination, it's how it's being created, Pinter creates a nightmarish impression of Stanley's sudden subordination in the face of social orthodoxy through extremely restrained stage directions that display the subtext of his protagonist's fear, and disjointed dialogue which exposes the accidental ways in which this dominance can be wielded. So there's a very thorough explanation of the different ways in which that protagonist subordination is being shaped through dramatic conventions in those two clauses of that sentence. And that structure will serve you really, really well in comparative writing for paper 2.